Hello, my name is Maciej Blaszyk, and welcome to part 2 of Module 1 of Summerhill Online Academy's IELTS Academic Writing Preparation course. In this section, we're going to take a look at some essential grammar structures and a few essential connectors that can help you maximize your score in IELTS academic writing. So as we saw in part 1, when describing data from graphs and charts, it's important to try to combine the information or describe information in just one or two sentences. So it's all about the efficient production of the language, and a good way to combine the different trends that we can see presented is through using subordinations. And we looked at these subordinations before in part 1. Subordinations like although, despite, and when are very useful subordinations that help us combine information together. In this part, we're going to take a look at although, despite, and when, and how to use although, despite, and when to combine information together when describing trends. So let's start with although. So we're going to take a look at this chart when describing although, and here we have a very easy chart, an easy trend, describing the population of raccoons in Toronto in thousands. So on the left side of our graph, we have the numbers of raccoons in Toronto, and then we have a scale of a year timeline every 5 years and a timeline of the population of raccoons in Toronto. Now, what we want to do is avoid using short, choppy sentences to describe these trends, but instead we can use a subordination like although to describe both of these trends, this increasing and decreasing trend in the population of raccoons in Toronto over this time period, in just one sentence using although. Let's go ahead and take a look at this example here. Although the population of raccoons in Toronto rose sharply from 20,000 in 1975 to 50,000 in 1980, this figure fell gradually to only 10,000 by 1990. Now, using this subordination although, we are able to combine two very differing trends. Although combines the concept the population of raccoons in Toronto rose sharply from 20,000 in 1975 to 50,000 in 1980, and the subsequent secondary trend, this figure fell gradually to only 10,000 by 1990. So we're actually combining two sentences or two trends together using the subordination although, which gives us a complex sentence. Notice that in the first part of the sentence, we are clearly mentioning the subject that we are describing, right? So this is actually, even though we're combining two sentences, this is actually considered one complex sentence because it combines two ideas using the subordination although. Now, because we're mentioning the subject, the population of raccoons, in the first part of the sentence, in the second part of the sentence, we don't have to repeat this subject. We can just use this figure or this number to signal that this figure or this number corresponds to the population of raccoons in Toronto. Okay? We can also see that we're using simple past here. Complex sentences are not necessarily sentences that have very complicated tenses. Here we're using simple past, and simple past is perfectly acceptable when describing trends in the past. We're also using adverbs, however, to show or signal the different degrees to which these rises and falls occur within a sentence. It's also important to remember the use of collocations, right? And actually, the use of collocations in writing task 1 is pretty simple. Collocations like from and to, and collocations like between and, right? From to and between and, when we're describing times and dates that change over time. Okay, so here's our first example, right, of using although. And again, there are some variations on how to use this, but the collocations, of course, have to correspond properly, right? So it's also very important to note that in the charts, I've seen this happen in many candidates. This is very common mistakes. Candidates will see on the graph information described in thousands, in millions, in hundreds. But when you're describing the actual data, you're describing the number as 20,000 or 50,000, right? So even though you see thousands and hundreds, you see this plural in the title of the chart, we must be aware that this is just the title of the charts. This is not how we describe the numbers, so be careful, right? It's 20,000, it's 20 million, right? It's not 20 millions or 20,000s. Okay? So despite and although are very, very similar. They're both, of course, subordinations. That mean the same thing. Although and despite both show contrast. However, unlike although, we use despite not with a full sentence, but with a gerund, right? Although rising sharply from 20,000 1975 to 50,000 1980, right? So we're using despite with gerund, rising, despite falling, right? It's very important to remember that when we use a subordination with a gerund, there is actually a missing subject. So we read the sentence, despite rising sharply for 20,000 1975 to 50,000 1980, there is actually no subject. We're not signaling what the subject of what is rising from 20,000 to 1975 and 50,000 in 1980 is in that phrase, right? This is why it's very important not to use shortcuts like this figure or this number, right? We have to very clearly articulate the subject of what we're describing in the subject of the next sentence, okay? And that's the main distinction between although and despite, right? When you start a sentence with although, you must use the full subject, and it's then permissible for you to use this figure or this number instead of repeating the subject. But when using despite and using a gerund, you must use the full subject of what it is that you're describing in the subject of the next sentence. When is a figure of time. It describes a particular moment in time. Okay? So that's what when really describes. It describes that moment when something happens. This is why you must use when only after a date, a time, right? A moment, when it signals a moment. So when is always used when writing the task 1. Always use when in the middle of the sentence, right after the date or the time that you're describing. The when signals a moment when a shift or a change happens. Okay? So again, we're comparing 3 structures, although, despite, and when. And although, despite, and when, all 3 of these subordinations can be used to describe complex trends using just one sentence. Okay? Be careful also with your punctuation. Like all subordinations, when you're starting a sentence with although, despite, and if, when, because, you must put a comma before the dependent and independent clause. It's important to put a comma between the first sentence or the first phrase and the second phrase. But when you're using when or other subordinations in the middle of a sentence, you do not put a comma. So when you use when to describe these trends, you do not put a comma before or after when. When is a subordination, it does not require a comma when you use it in the middle of a sentence. Trends, however, are a lot more complex than simply 2 trends happening at a time. More often than not, we have 2 or 3 trends that happen in a row, and once again, we can still use although, when, while, to combine these different sentences together, but we can use them in a combination. For example, we could describe this trend using although and when as a combination. So, as an example, although the population of raccoons in Toronto rose significantly from 20,000 in 1975 to 30,000 in 1980, this figure rose dramatically to 80,000 in 1985, when the number of raccoons fell sharply to less than 10,000 by 1990. As we can see, we are actually combining all of that information using although and when, and we're combining three different trends using these two subordinations. The first subordination, although, effectively combines the first and second trend, and when, which is again followed by a date, a time, signals the change into a third trend. Okay? It's also important to remember that with the first use of although, we have to clearly articulate the subject of the sentence, but because the subject of the sentence, the population of raccoons in Toronto, was mentioned in the first phrase, it's totally okay for us to use this figure or this number to indicate that this is the same subject that we were talking before. But after using when, right, we can paraphrase, we can still say this number or this number of raccoons because we're speaking about the same subject. So always remember, if you start a sentence with although to describe trends in academic writing task 1, make sure to articulate the full subject of the sentence. With despite and when, it's very similar to what we saw before, right? Despite is a subordination. Here we're using a despite and when to combine these three trends together. But notice that because we're using despite, we are actually not mentioning the subject of what we're describing in the first phrase. We're just using a gerund, rising significantly. This is why it is essential to articulate the actual subject of what we're describing in the subject of next sentence. But once we do that, it's again totally permissible for us to use this figure or this number after when. Please be careful, when comes after the date. So again, we can use a combination of despite and when, or although and when, to combine these important trends together. Once again, be careful with your punctuation. When starting a sentence with despite and although, make sure to put a comma after the first sentence, after the first trend. But when using when in the middle of a sentence, we do not put a comma because when is in the middle of the sentence. Right? So connecting trends using subordinations like although, despite, and when is absolutely essential because it will allow us to create complex sentences that effectively and efficiently combine complex trends into very short but effective sentences. So the key point here is try to connect as much information using subordinations and connectives in order to form efficient sentences. Right? Point is, avoid short, choppy sentences with simple grammar. You simply will not score a high score if you use short, choppy sentences. The highest scores you can reach depend on your ability to connect these trends together.